food and gladness. Even saying these things with difficulty, they restrained the crowds from offering sacrifice to them. But Jews came from Antioch and Iconium, and having won over the crowds, they stoned Paul and dragged him out of the city, supposing him to be dead. But while the disciples stood around him, he got up and entered the city. The next day he went away with Barnabas to Derbe. And after he had preached the gospel to that city and had made many disciples, they returned to Lystra and to Iconium and to Antioch, strengthening the souls of the disciples, encouraging them to continue in the faith, and saying, through many tribulations we must enter the kingdom of God. And when they had appointed elders for them in every church, having prayed with fasting, they commended them to the Lord, in whom they had believed. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. You may be seated. We're going to jump right back into the narrative. If you're new, we've been going through the book of Acts for quite some time, and so we're going to jump right back where we left off. And today, we're going to jump straight into a summary because we need to know the context of what's going on here if we're going to understand what happens in the middle of the chapter, which is this very strange thing where Paul and Barnabas are mistaken as Greek gods, and then they start offering sacrifices. We're going to need to do it. And we're going to try to go by, because this chapter, when I read it, it's one of those chapters where in 28 short verses, a lot happens. They go to 3 cities, and all that sorts of stuff happens, but you only get a snapshot. It's kind of like watching TikTok or like YouTube Shorts these days. I hate it. It makes me old, I know. But it's like you only get a little snippet of it, so we're going to try to break it down and open it up a little bit more. If the parents have no idea what I'm talking about, it's good for your soul that you don't know, so it's okay. We can move on. So let's get right into the summary, shall we? So Luke tells us right in the text that these are going to be the last 3 final stops of Paul's first missionary journey. Iconium, Lystra, and Derbe, before he starts heading back to Antioch. That's where he started, retracing his steps, right, and visiting some of the places that he had already stopped by on the way there. So if you look at the overall map here, I know it's really small. It's in the right corner down here. I just gave you the whole map because you can see that's kind of where Italy is, or present day. We're kind of in Turkey over here to the right side of the map. That's the whole journey that you look at. And so he goes from Antioch and he makes his journey, and then he makes his way back. Now, at the end of chapter 13, we found out that Paul and Barnabas, they were being kicked out of Pisidian Antioch, and therefore they headed to Iconium, the 2 that are highlighted on the map. Now, in Iconium, they did what they have always done. They preached to the Jews and others, right, in a Jewish synagogue as they had, and some believe and some don't. And then, as we've seen in the past before, another division occurs right in this city. And as we've noted before, again, the division isn't friendly. It is heated. It is not good. And because it's heated, right, actually we found out that Paul and Barnabas, they stay longer digging into the work that the God wanted them to do, and then God helps them out, essentially, by doing signs and wonders to bolster the word of grace, right? But the division and the heatedness gets so bad, the hate gets so loud that the people start to scheme to stone Paul and Barnabas, and thankfully, right before it happens, they find out about it, and they escape at the last minute. So they go from Iconium to the next part, which is Lystra. And Lystra, though it is a very short journey away from Iconium, it is a very, very different city altogether. First, though Lystra is very close to Iconium, the people of Lystra are mostly illiterate. It's hill country folk. They're not educated. They cannot read. And therefore, there isn't a Jewish synagogue there. And so all this means that the people of Lystra have literally zero knowledge and understanding, and maybe most importantly, access and exposure to the Jewish faith. So far, in the first 13 chapters of Acts, we've encountered a lot of Gentiles, but up until this point, every single one of them have had a little bit of Jewish something, right? Whether it's the proselytes, who are literally Gentiles, fully converted to Judaism, they got circumcised, that whole bit. You have the God-fearers who are Gentiles, but then they go to the synagogue, they read the Bible, they pray, so on and so forth. They read the scriptures, they pray, so on and so forth. And then you have like family and friends of the God-fearers, which means, again, a little bit of access, a little bit of exposure. But here, you have complete and total pagans who know nothing and have zero access to anything Jewish, period. They're literal newbies to the Jewish faith of any kind. And so when Paul and Barnabas arrive, they notice that there's a man who had been lame from birth, and Paul recognizes that he has the faith to be healed, and in a bit of a dramatic fashion, he heals him. He says, "Stand up on your feet." And the guy leaps up, and he begins to walk. Now, we've seen this type of thing before, already in Acts with Peter, but also, of course, through Jesus' ministry. But what happens next is the crazy thing that we're going to focus on today. The people of Lystra, they get so excited about what Paul and Barnabas does that they think that Paul and Barnabas are the Greek gods Zeus and Hermes disguised in human form in their midst. So they raise a hoopla. They start shouting in their own language, aka Paul and Barnabas can't understand a thing that they're saying. And then eventually the priest from the temple of Zeus comes by with oxen and garlands, and they get ready to have a good old-fashioned sacrificial ceremony. And so Paul and Barnabas were like, oh, shoot, no, thank you. So they rush out, right? And they start tearing their robes, trying to put a stop to it. By the way, tearing robes is what Jewish people do when they think people are blaspheming. So like, no, you can't do this. They're tearing their clothes and saying, stop. We're men, we're humans, just like you. Now, let's stop before we move on for the rest of the thing and imagine this scene is quite fascinating and hilarious to me. Right? Because on one hand, you have all these hill country bumpkins from Lystra who don't read, right? And who have this like Greek ceremony thing that they're getting ready to do. And on the other hand, you have two Jewish Christians, right? Who are tearing the robes saying, you see us tearing us robes? This is how serious we're taking it. And yet the Greeks are probably like, I have no idea what you're doing. They might as well be like, stop taking your clothes off. I don't know what you're doing. Keep your clothes on. Like, it's indecent. Like, what are you doing? And then Paul, no, just stop doing this. And it's like just confusion, right? Many of us are immigrants. There's a lot of cultural, lost in translation. Oh yeah, that's happening big time here. But as they're tearing their clothes, then Paul and Barnabas, they get a chance to speak the gospel to them as we would expect. But interestingly, this gospel presentation, as you see on the screen, is unlike any of the gospel presentations that we've seen so far in the book of Acts. Few things to note. One, it's really short. Two, there's literally no mention of Jesus, no mention of the cross, no mention of the resurrection, none of that stuff. And then third, there's also no mention of like what happened in the Old Testament and how Jesus fulfills all that stuff. None of the regular things you find are there. This is the entire thing that you see on the screen. A few verses. To contrast, Paul's presentation of the gospel in chapter 13 was like 26 verses long, right? So a very, very different thing. And the message is actually really simple. It's this. I can summarize it for you literally in a sentence. Paul tells him simply, turn away from your worthless, empty, and fruitless idols. That's what the word vain means. And then turn to God. Why? Because he's a living and true God who has provided for you all this time, though you and many people turned your back on him. Simple message. And then before you know it, the enemies from Iconium and Antioch, actually, they've been following and tracking Paul and Barnabas all along. They get to the city. They turn the once amazed and like worshiping community, right, against Paul and Barnabas. And then they end up stoning him. They stone him so bad that they think he's dead, because he almost literally is. And then they drag his limp, almost dead body out of the city and leave him there to rot. And then the disciples, right, the brethren, the Christians, have also kind of followed them here. They discover Paul in the outside of the city, and then they surround him, trying to take care of him. And then Paul isn't quite yet dead. And so Paul gets up. Crazy enough, he goes back into the city, spends the night there, and then he makes his way over to Derbe, which is the next city over. It's about a 60-mile journey, which begs to ask, how does Paul make it 60 miles in those days in that shape? But he does. And then we're told Paul preaches the gospel in Derbe, and it works. Many people come to faith. But what you need to know about Derbe is that Derbe is also like Lystra, aka no Jewish synagogue, no trace of Judaism whatsoever, and potentially the people there are also illiterate. So people think, and I agree, that the gospel message, though we're not told what they say, is very similar to what he preached in Lystra. And the thing is, it works, and it works really well. And interestingly, Derbe is the only place where Paul and Barnabas go on any of their 3 journeys where there is zero persecution to speak of. And to boot, on top of that, Paul actually goes to Derbe each and every single time he goes on a journey. So all 3 journeys, he visits this one city. I think that may be the only city he visits every single time. There may be another one, but one of a few, if any, cities that he visits each and every single time. It's something is happening there. And then we find out, to kind of finish the summary, after he preaches, he's building up a church there. He recuperates from his injuries, I'm sure. Paul then and Barnabas make their way all the way back to Antioch. And interestingly, they stop in places in particular where there's been lots of persecution. And in those places, they strengthen up the church. They tell them, hey, remain in your faith. And then they say this very interesting line. They say, because, why? Through many tribulations, we must enter the kingdom of God. We didn't read the last 5 verses, but that all happens in 28 very short verses. But what we want to focus on today is what happens in the middle, that very interesting thing that happens when they preach the gospel and people think that they're gods, and then what that means for us today. So here are the 2 questions we're going to ask to kind of break this down today, okay? Here they are. First, what's with this new gospel? Why is it so different? Why speak it like this? And then secondly, why was it so effective? Why does it work? Okay, we want to look at that. And then secondly, what's with all the persecution? If you've been here for a while, or even if you're new, just know, Persecution is everywhere in the book of Acts. We've talked about it literally every single week. And many of you might be like, seriously? Is it really all that necessary to talk about persecution over and over and over again? We get it already. Let's move on. So we're going to look at that, okay? So 2 questions. Let's go 1 and then 2. First, a new gospel to the pagans. Now, we're trying to go back to Thailand for missions this year, as you know, and we try to go on missions, but the pandemic kind of did a number on us, but hopefully we'll go back. But if we go on missions of any kind and we go to a new country, if our team or any team preached this version of the gospel, I think, I'm going to guess and assume that someone on the team, though they may not say it, would think in their hearts, that was really bad. Because that's not the gospel. It doesn't sound like the gospel, right? Like if you ask somebody, what's the gospel? And they give you that answer, you'd be like, no, you missed it. Because in every gospel, right, or every understanding of the gospel, you would think there's got to be some Jesus, there's got to be some cross, there's got to be some sin and forgiveness and resurrection, so on and so forth. But this is not it. So you could even say, that's not the gospel. Like, good story. It's not like it's untrue, but it's not the gospel. We may even think, having gone on the mission field, that we may have missed or wasted an opportunity to share the gospel, because that simply won't work, we'll say. So then we go, wait. So what is Apostle Paul doing? Because clearly he must have known what he's doing, right? And so although it may not seem like he knows what he's doing great, it surely was effective, we hear, in Derbe. Perhaps most effective in Derbe. And so what is Paul doing? Well, I think he's doing this very interesting thing. I think Paul is speaking their language. Now, there's a quote by Nelson Mandela that I was reminded of this past weekend speaking to somebody, and he says this: if you talk to a man in a language he understands, that goes to his head. But if you talk to him in his language, that goes to his heart. Now remember, these folks are total pagans. 0 connection, 0 access, 0 exposure to God, and also illiterate, which means they know nothing about the scriptures. Which means any mention of the scriptural things like Jesus and the cross, it's just not going to mean much, and it's not going to be effective. Because you're speaking a language they have no idea of, and they would have probably disregarded it. We're a Korean American church, so most of us in here are Korean American. But if you go to an ethnic church of any kind, you realize there's a lot of language barriers. You can say one thing and they hear a whole other thing. And so a lot of the times you say this and they don't understand that, and then so on and so forth. If you're students here, you might have that issue with your parents. I apologize for that, but that's what happens. You don't have the communication stuff. You got to speak the right language. And so Paul decides to then switch it up and speak the gospel in a way that they would understand, and it's absolutely brilliant. Let me explain it to you. He says this. He says, you know your gods? The gods that you worship, they're vain, they're empty, they're worthless, they're useless. What are you doing worshiping them? Turn from them and rather turn to the living God, the creator of heaven, earth, sea, and everything that's in it. Because so many people like you have turned away from him, but yet he kept providing even though you did. Now again, when you look at this message just on the surface, you might be like, but Pastor Pete, that's so basic. It's so rudimentary. Like, what does that do? It's unimpressive. If I preach the gospel like that in here, one, you may be happy because it literally takes 25 seconds. You'd be like, ooh, 25-second sermon, the best day ever. And you may walk out and be happy with that. But most of you would not be like, ooh, that was an impressive sermon. Good one, Pastor Pete. I can see how much work you did there. Not going to happen. You wouldn't be sharing this on the way out. But it works. And it works because it touches those folks, the hearers, in a way in their heart that you and I wouldn't understand unless we know what they're going through or if we put ourselves in their shoes. So let's do that for a second. Now, you may know every culture in the history of the world, every human culture in human history has its unique and specific legends. Legends are stories that people tell that shape the way people believe, act, and all those things. So let me give you an example. Again, I'm Korean, and I grew up with my grandmother, and she would say crazy things to me all the time that didn't make any sense to me, but she swore they were real, okay? And one of the ones that I will never forget, and the craziest one, is simply, do not cut your toenails or fingernails at night. Every time I did, I'd get in trouble. And I'd be like, woman, like, lady, honey, like, what is wrong with you? And there's a real thing. Crazy. If you haven't heard it, let me explain. Legend has it in Korea, apparently, that if you cut your nails at night, wherever you threw them away, rats would come to it, eat it, and then they would somehow turn into evil human beings who would come back to hurt you or maybe even steal your soul. So unless you wanted your soul stolen at night by a bunch of rats that were grown because you cut your nails, don't cut your nails. So every time I did it, I would get in big trouble, and I'd be like, lady, leave me alone. Just let me cut my nails. Maybe that's why I have like finger biting habits, because that's how I do it, like secretly maybe. Well, as ridiculous as that sounds, as you understand, the Greeks were no different. They had legends of their own too. And there's a legend here that many people don't know that informs everything that's happening here in this scene. And so let me tell you how it goes. This is just a picture of it, okay? So if you know the Greek gods, right? Zeus and Hermes, they're pretty famous. One day, apparently, Zeus and Hermes decided to disguise themselves as men and then visit a hill country in Phrygia. And Phrygia is kind of the land over next to where Iconium and Laconia is, okay? And they wanted to essentially see how willing people would be to give two strangers hospitality and care. So apparently they went around, right? And they were like, hey, we're two foreigners, we're not from around here, but hey, we need some help. Like, we've been walking around a long time, we've been journeying, can you care for us? And so they went around knocking on doors and visiting people, and nobody said yes. Everybody rejected them. Oh, nope, sorry. And then eventually, this old couple, who were quite poor themselves, apparently said, okay, why don't you come on? If they were texting, they'd be like, come on in, sugar, let's go. And they bring them in, they feed them, they house them, right? And they care for them, and they say, you can stay as long as you need to, and then leave whenever you need. So they stayed however long, and then eventually they left and then returned back to their mountaintop or wherever it is that they came from. But upon getting back to their mountaintop, they were so disappointed and upset in the people, they decided to do two things. One, they were so happy with this old couple, they decided to reward them lavishly. But the second thing they did, they were so mad at everybody else that they destroyed the entire town. Just wiped them out. Done. So the people of Lystra, again, one land over, know this legend. And then when these two random men out of nowhere come, and they start doing things that no humans have the power to do, all of a sudden the light bulb goes and like, oh, yeah, this is it. I told you, we knew they were going to come and visit us. Here they are, and we can't be like those fools in Phrygia. So let's go ham. So they decide to get the Zeus temple priest come over. They bring the oxen, and they're about to have a big old shindig, offer a sacrificial ceremony kind of a thing. And then Paul and Barnabas are like, oh, no. So they start tearing their clothes and doing all these things. And you hear that they barely get them to stop. The people are really, really adamant that they want to treat these gods well, because they know what happens if you don't. They want to show them the respect that they deserve. So Paul and Barnabas, seemingly knowing this, then speaks a language that hits them straight in the heart. And this is when the message that he speaks takes on a whole new idea. He says, you know your gods? The ones that you think we are, they're worthless. They're empty, they're vain, and they're useless. You know why? Because in the end, they are gods who take way more from you than they give to you. They're gods who demand things, and when they do not happen, they act in their anger, and they will surely punish you greater than you deserve. And we all know what life is like under the care of gods like this, don't we? It's nerve-wracking. Why? Because you know they have these crazy demands, and when you cannot do them, they punish you. And moreover, they can ask for them whenever it is that they want. And maybe they'll reward you, maybe if they're in a good mood, but mostly, 100%, if you fail, they will surely punish you. And Greek gods were known to be very temperamental, selfish, emotionally unstable, so on and so forth. So Paul and Barnabas says, turn away from them. They're not worth it. Turn to the living God, the creator of all things. Notice, creator of all things, everything. In the Greek system, you had gods of lots of things. A god of this, a god of that, a god of war, a god of agriculture, a god of love, a god of whatever. But they're saying, no, this is the living God, creator of all things, heaven, earth, sea, and everything in it. And so it's speaking their language now. They're like, oh, I get it, yeah. We love gods, or we understand gods, and yeah, we can understand that there may be a God above all of the gods who is the creator. When I was younger, when I was living in Canada, I used to do missions to the Aboriginals of Canada, aka they're the Native Americans of the Canadian version. They call them First Nations. And whenever we went over there, right, we were taught to speak in the language of the Creator. Because if you know anything about Native Americans and Aboriginals, they were largely and heinously treated by Christians in these residential school systems. And so to talk about Jesus and those things was just like out of bounds. So you had to speak of the Creator, because so much of the world, if not all the world, acknowledges that there is indeed a Creator of some kind. So they're speaking their language. And then he then adds, and he says, this Creator, you know this, he allowed people to walk away, But even when they did, he didn't leave himself without witness. He didn't leave himself without some words, though he gave them the choice. And when people walked away, you know what he did? He didn't do what your gods would have done, that's for sure. Because if he was like them, he would have, could have, and should have gotten really angry and punished everyone. But no, he kept providing the rain and crops, all so that you could have harvest and be fruitful and glad. So why won't you turn to him? If he has provided the